Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm talking about the craft of writing. This is the 7th episode. I haven't posted anything about writing in a while because I wanted to talk about characterization, and characterization is both very simple and very difficult because you can do just about anything to give attributes to a character in a work of fiction. So let's take a look at some of the tools that I've come up with to help you try to figure out how do you create a character in your stories. Now, this is not a definitive list necessarily, but it's just one of the ways that I look at it. So we have direct attribution of characteristics, cultural and historic stereotypes that you can use, character descriptions, obviously that's the ones that English professors and teachers really like, personal location descriptions, those are fun. You do a whole lot with that. Natural world attributions, and of course character actions. I would like to stop and just make a point here, is that most English teachers, professors, and creative writing teachers that I've had in my life always say, show, don't tell, and honestly that's mostly a lie. It's a written medium and you mostly tell and not show. Showing something takes a long time. How do you show that somebody's happy or sad over a period? Anyway, you can spend 80,000 words or something trying to show how a person is, where what we're looking for is how do you very rapidly create a character so that your readers aren't floating around going, well, who's this person, who's that person? And these are kind of the tools that I like to use. So let's talk about attribution, and this is really the easiest method of doing it, and this is when a character either says something about themselves or another character, which then helps you define the characteristics of that second person character. So for example, you can do internal dialogue. That's pretty popular. If somebody told you that they hated puppies and they make you angry, it gives you a really good image really quickly of what that person is like. You can do a dialogue attribution, so somebody could say something like, Tom, you need to avoid him, he's too sensitive and easy to hurt. That's very quick. Now you know a whole lot about Tom in what? 3 sentences? 4 maybe? And then the narrator can make attributions too. Tom was cool and aloof and had no time for crybabies. If I was going to try to show that one sentence in action, it probably would take me 2 or 3 chapters to make that point, so I can just throw it out there right then and there, and the readers are not confused or lost about who Tom is. I would like also to talk about some cultural stereotypes, and this is a really powerful tool. It doesn't necessarily go across cultures, so if you're writing in the Western world, it may not work, for example, in an Eastern context. But stereotypes aren't always bad. The stereotype of stereotypes is that stereotypes is bad. But, I have this picture of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee up here because it's a masterful way that novel is a masterful way of using stereotypes in the Western world, particularly in America, to make a social point about equality and fairness and honor and all that. So just real quick, for example, a stereotype of a Southern belle, little Southern belle girl, is thrown on its ears because Scout is what? She's a tomboy. And then of course the narrator for that story is Scout, who's grown up. And again, the ditzy Southern belle thing doesn't exist for that narrator because she's very considerate and thinking and passionate when she's talking about this particular time in her life. You got a stereotype that's very common about lawyers being shysters. Well, the most honorable person in this story is, of course, Atticus. You've got this stereotype of emotionally disturbed persons being dangerous and lost and not really understanding what's going on. But Boo Radley is actually the physical hero of that story. Then at the time that this was written, you had certain stereotypes about African Americans that were much stronger than they are today. And those are all turned on its heels because this guy didn't do anything wrong. He's nice, he's friendly, he's everything that you would not expect in those stereotypes of the day. And she also uses stereotypes and cements them to give you characterizations of people, not flipping them on their end, which is what Kill a Mockingbird is all about. But the good example is the lady that accuses the African-American guy of raping her. She is the typical stereotype of the trailer trash, 6 dogs, broken cars in the driveway type of person. So Harper Lee is using stereotypes very, very wisely and strongly and in interesting ways throughout that novel. So you can see how stereotypes are very valuable. And you can also use it in a very short way, especially for secondary and tertiary characters. Using a cultural stereotype can very rapidly explain that person to the reader. So for example, the one that I have down here that I think is pretty interesting is prostitutes and drug addicts have no morals and are bad mothers. You can use that very quickly just by saying somebody was a prostitute. You can wrap her in that blanket of characterization. But you could also write a novel about that, because you could do what Harper Lee did and take that stereotype and flip it around. Maybe she's a great mother. Maybe she has lots of morals. Maybe there's something else going in her life that's making her do that particular job. So that would be a very long, interesting novel to take that cultural stereotype and flip it. But if you only have, this is a secondary, tertiary character and it can show up just in 1 or 2 scenes, basically you can just wrap them into the stereotype of what a prostitute is like. So don't forget to use cultural stereotypes in your writing, but you do so consciously, not by accident. In a very similar manner, you can talk historic stereotypes, which is basically wrapping up one of your characters in a historic personality, whether it's a character or a well-known historic person. And here's just some quick examples on the screen. So if I say Tom reminded her of Dracula, if you've read Dracula, if you watch vampire movies, an image just flashed through your head about what Tom is like. It's that quickly. That's what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. And I've just characterized Tom very succinctly. And again, that doesn't have to be the truth. I mean, the truth, because this is coming through Susan's point of view, Tom could turn out to be a great guy, and it's just, to call him Dracula is not fair. So it depends on what you want to do as a writer. And then the one below it, I compare Tom with Stalin. Of course, Stalin was a murdering, cruel, vindictive, evil person. And so that's Tom right off the bat. And then you can compare Tom to like Old Yella, the dog that saved the kid. Loyal like Old Yella, and perseverance like Churchill. But you see what I'm doing. You can also be a little bit cheeky, like the Pope one is pretty cheeky. The Pope wouldn't like Tom because Tom was too honest. So I've defined Tom pretty quickly, and I've taken a little snide little swipe at organized religion there. But I would point out that you have to be aware of that character may not be known well throughout the potential audience. So for example, this second to the last one here with John Keats, if you don't like poetry and you haven't read romantic poetry, you may have no idea who John Keats is. So what I did here is I gave a little bit of history of John Keats within the first 2 sentences, so you kind of know, oh, he's probably a poet, and he probably died young. And then if you've studied his poetry and you know a little bit about his life, you get a little deeper reading of how Tom may be like John Keats. So that's kind of the idea. So use those historic characters that are well known or semi-well known and wrap your character up in that impression of that historic or well-known fictional character. And then, of course, character descriptions. This is a very popular method, and this is one of the 2 things I think that literature professors really enjoy, because you can do so much with a character description. And yeah, there are some obvious things, like Quasimodo with his, hump on his shoulder, but he turns out to be a hero type of thing. I mean, that all happens. The ugly guy who's nice on the inside, like Beauty and the Beast type of bit, which I think is a little bit over the top use of this technique. But it very clearly, so if I describe this guy as tall and lean, he's wearing a blue shirt that's color coordinated, he's glancing around casually, you get a really good sense of who the man is very, very quickly, and what's that 7 short sentences. And then the same thing with cool and tough. Now, last time I recorded this, it took like 45 minutes because I read all these things and kind of explained them. So I'm just going to leave it on the screen here for a second, and you can pause the video and look at it and try to see what I was doing, and if you agreed that I was doing a good character description, if you know something about the characters that I'm talking about. So here's a couple more examples. The personal location descriptions, that's a lot of fun. You can do so much with this, but here's basically the gist of it, is that if you were to come into my house and look around and you saw, like, for example, my guitars over here, the pictures I have on the wall, my pets and my kids, things that I've done in my life, you would get a really good sense of who I was just by looking around. And that's what you're doing. You're taking advantage of that very human character tendency to surround yourselves with things that are important to you. So taking that and associating a particular place with a character and then describing that place is really a good way to describe the character themselves. So in the first example here, so Tom's a rich guy, so you're talking about most mid-income family can't afford the homes. It's got marble floors and arched ceilings, the furniture coming out of a GQ magazine and cost a fortune. So you know that Tom's rich, and then the part that I like about this is that Susan focuses her eyes on what? The fist-sized hole in the wall, so he's rich, he's spoiled, he has a bit of a temper, right? And you can do the same thing with poor and desperate. And again, these impressions, depending on the narrator's point of view or the point of view that's making these assumptions about the other character, can be absolutely true. They can be absolutely wrong. It depends what you want to do with your story as the author of that story. So here's a couple more examples. So in the first one, you see, Tom is smart and pretty pragmatic. And the second one, you can see he's basically a Christian. And if you know a little bit about Catholicism, you know about Palm Sunday, then if there's palm leaves that are dried and put behind the crucifix, and there's holy water, it's probably a Catholic. But you don't have to get that deep into that description of Tom. If you don't have that, you still know he's a religious person and probably Christian. And then, of course, you can associate somebody with something that you find in nature, whether it's a physical object or an animal, or a sound or a mood, which kind of gives you a sense of what that person's feeling internally. And this is very popular as well in fiction. So just some really quick examples, like Granite, Tom was strong and powerful but cold. And that's kind of how it works. Tom's like a puppy, a happy puppy. Yeah. So these are the tools that I've tried to identify for how you create aspects of a person's character. There's that direct attribution of characteristics. That's again when another character or the narrator associates the character you're trying to describe with some sort of attribution. There's the cultural and historic stereotypes when you're wrapping that person up in either a cultural stereotype like all doctors are very, very smart but have no common sense type of stereotypes, or historic by comparing him to a historic character like MacArthur or Hitler, whatever you want to try to get across. Very quick way of doing that. Character descriptions, very useful because what people look like reflects obviously their personality. Personal location descriptions, which we talked about pretty much in depth. I like playing guitar, so I'm not going to have a drum set in my house because I can't play the drums, but I can play guitars. And I like guitars, so if I have guitars here, then obviously I like guitars and I don't play drums. So you can create that aspect of my character just by looking around my house. Then there's the natural world attributions, which everybody seems to be quite comfortable with. And then character actions, which is the least effective because it takes longer to do it. So especially for the secondary and tertiary characters, you probably are going to avoid a lot of character actions and use one of these other tools, because those characters are going to show up and then they're going to disappear really quickly, and you really want the character actions for your main characters, your protagonists, and your important secondary characters. So how can you use this when you're writing a story? I have lists of my characters' names, and this is roughly what I do. I have adjectives that describe them, so direct attributions I can use. So if I have another character that's going to describe Tom, I might say, Susan thought he was friendly, for example. It's cultural stereotypes. Tom is a private detective. There are a bunch of stereotypes just went through your mind, or something like that, right? In this case, it's a car mechanic. Historic stereotype, Abraham Lincoln. I can wrap him up in an Abraham Lincoln blanket, and then you'll know, if you're from the United States, at least you'll have an instant picture of what he's like. Character description helps. If he's in work overhauls, he's a working class guy, not a college professor or a scientist, for example. Personal location description, let's say this mechanic shop is really organized, and actions, he helps somebody fix a car and that person has no money. And what I can do, if this is a story where my character is going to change, I might have 2 or 3 of these lists for Tom. 1 is what he's like at the beginning of the novel. 2, what he's like right after whatever the incident is that's going to change his personality or his outlook on life. And then a 3rd list that might describe Tom at the end of the novel when he's changed. Now, you don't always have to have a character that changes through a character arc, as you very well know. One of the great examples in American literature is that character, especially in cowboy movies and hard detective novels, where the character refuses to change even though everybody else is trying to force him to do something. He sticks to his ethics. So characters don't necessarily have to change. You can be a hero for sticking around, for not changing. But if you want to change, that's a good technique to use. Write those lists of that character at 3 points in the novel, and then change your descriptions of that character slowly to meet the changes in the character's character arc. So here's how it might work. Now, what I have is on the right, I've got the list of the technique that I'm using kind of in order, and then I'm actually going to spend a little bit of time and talk about this little paragraph and a half to kind of show you where it's at. And what you'll see is that I'm combining all sorts of things, scene descriptions and attributions and all this stuff. So that's why it's kind of a mesh. Characterization is a mesh of all sorts of tools, and it's difficult to pull out those little individual tools and identify them and talk about them. So let's take a look here real quick and find out how I tried to apply these tools to this paragraph and a half. So Susan looked at Tom. What that bit does is it's telling you that you're looking through Susan's point of view, so she's going to attribute all these characteristics to Tom. It could be completely true, it could be completely false. So Susan looked at Tom. He was young, seemed friendly, and the overalls he wore were scrubbed clean. So very quickly, he's a friendly guy and he's a clean guy. Not a single oil stain was matted into the fabric. The vehicle bay of his shop was meticulously clean. Each item had its own place. Tools hung neatly on the wall above the workbench. Boxes of spare parts were neatly aligned on metal shelving, and loose nuts and bolts were segregated into plastic bins. So what I've got is direct attribution. Susan attributing the friendliness to Tom. You got a character description, which shows that he's a neat person. And then you've got location description, which amplifies that. And this all goes against the kind of uneducated, messy stereotype of mechanics that you find a lot, particularly in movies. And then I've got some character actions coming up next. So let's continue here. Where was that? There was it. So Susan smiled at him, and he shyly smiled back and ran his fingers through his hair, pushing the dark bangs out of his eyes. So he's shyly smiling. So now you've learned a little bit about Tom right there, right? He's very shy, and then pushing the bangs out of his hair kind of goes back and harkens back to he was young, right? Now I'm going to wrap him up in a historic stereotype, which goes against the typical cultural stereotype of what a mechanic is like. I'm going to go against that grain with this historic wraparound. So his fingers were lithe and strong, and he reminded Susan of images of Abraham Lincoln. He was tall, deliberate in his movement and speech, and possessed a type of dignity she did not expect in a mechanic. So again, the historic stereotype I'm using here is a contrasting model, and it's contrasting Abraham Lincoln against a mechanic. And I think at the end of this, you have a really good sense of who Tom is and what is this, 15-something short sentences instead of 80,000 words to show that Tom is all these things. I'm just telling you, all right? So tell, don't show. And then, of course, I have a natural world attribution coming up and character's actions. So don't worry about paying me now. Tom's voice was that of an old man, deep and smooth like water flowing over rocks, which does what? An old man reminds you of Lincoln, which reminds you of this tall, strong figure that's, you know what I'm saying? I'm tying all these things together. They're all referencing what's going on in the paragraph above. Everybody gets a little behind now and again. You can pay when you have the money. So that action, represented by what Tom says, you can pay when you have the money, it shows that he's also a generous person. So all you have to do is read this. If this was Tom's introduction, you could say, wow, he seems like a really nice guy. He's hands-on, but he's kind, and he's young and strong, and he's not stupid, and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, this at all can be a lie. I mean, this could be a story about how Susan ended up in a serial killer's pot and was eaten and killed, type of thing. And it's an absolute lie, and Tom is just hiding his true nature by acting this way. Or it could be that Tom is exactly this way. It depends on what you want to do as a writer. But that's how you're taking all these tools and you try to weave them into what you're writing. And you can see how enmeshed and embellished and twisted and turned these processes are, and why sometimes it can be difficult to realize that what you're doing is you're creating character by using these tools. But that's kind of how it works. So this is my little bit on characterization. How do you create a character in a novel, in fiction? And again, you find it in everything from TV to TV writing, movie writing, novels, short stories. You even see it a lot in poetry, especially the historic references and referencing other characters. That's very popular in poetry, for example. And I hope that you have found this useful, and that next time when you're sitting around and you're writing your story, you start going, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, let me tweak it, because now I kind of have a better understanding of what I'm doing. I can control it better and have better characterization throughout the course of my novel. So all that said and done, I guess it's time to go. Thanks for stopping by. Don't forget to like and share my video, and I will see you all